Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now in our study to an introduction to Homer's Odyssey. Now, if you haven't been following what we've been doing, hit learnstrong.net, find that AP folder there, and you'll see all of our lectures for Iliad. We have worked now book by book through the Iliad. We've done an outline of the primary stories of the fall of Troy, as we called it. And now we turn to Homer's Odyssey. We'll see, in fact, the power of our learning theory in 303. That is to say, we want to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. I know some of you are like, dude, why does he keep saying this? I'm gonna hopefully show you the power of reading through reading. In other words, once you've read the Iliad closely, picking up the Odyssey and reading it will be much easier because you have a template for how to read an epic poem. But B, and more significantly, I think you're going to begin to connect and relate all kinds of important information from the Iliad to the Odyssey in creative ways. Now, before we start this, I think it makes sense in our study for each of the 24 books of the Odyssey. Let's get an overview of the Odyssey, where we're headed, and let's argue that, and I'm not the first one to say any of the things that I've been saying, and certainly here, but reading the Odyssey is kind of like taking an Odyssey, and we'll kind of comment maybe on the ways that that is true, right? Now, from the earliest of days, critiquers or scholars of this poem have challenged it as the second epic of Homer, right? For example, who, or maybe a group of people, not an individual, created this poem? Remember, it was probably chanted or sung long before it was written down. Is it possible we have a different Homer here, if you will? Why? In other words, another question. Why is this poem so different from the first poem, the Iliad, right? And can it consider the Odyssey to be of lesser value or even greater value than the Iliad? Now, some of these arguments we'll pick up maybe in this conversation. Others of these arguments we're just going to leave alone for now. For first, right off the bat though, let's just get a brief overview of the plot and just get a sense of it. If the key word in the Iliad is right there in the opening line, sing, O goddess, the rage of Achilles. Here are the opening lines of Fagel's translation. Again, we're working with Fagel's. I think he's got the best translation for us to work with. The opening lines of the Odyssey. Sing to me, the invocation of the muse, we call this right. Sing to me of the man, muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course once he had plundered the hollow heights of Troy. So right away, notice if the first poem is not about Achilles, but the rage of Achilles. We talked a lot about that in our series of lectures on the Iliad. Here, we have a poem about a man. A man of, it's hard to translate the phrase, scholars tell us, out of the Greek, that here Fagels will translate as twists and turns. Quite literally, Odysseus goes through lots and lots of twists and turns, and in fact at the end of this very lecture, we'll maybe comment on some of those twists and turns. But as well, there's not just physical twists and turns, there's rhetorical, there's linguistic, there's emotional, etc., etc. Driven, he is a driven man, no question. Time and again off course, once he had plundered the hollow heights of Troy. And in fact, we're going to see that this poem mirrors in many ways the Iliad in terms of its sequencing, its culminating contest and the fight with the suitors and all of that. We're told many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. The reticence here for Alfred Lord Tennyson's Ulysses, a poem that we'll study later, will come to mind immediately. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. We often forget that Odysseus was not just concerned with himself, but with his comrades, and by the time he arrives in Ithaca, not going to be any left. So right away, there is a word out of the in the Greek, nostros, which is hard. It's hard to translate, but homecoming or return is usually the way it works. Let's make some comparisons. If the Iliad is a straight line from A to B, the Odyssey is anything other than that. It's very circular, and it's cyclical in its storytelling. Let's do a real quick overview. Books 1 through 4, we are actually not focusing on Odysseus, but rather on his homeland Ithaca, and more particularly his son Telemachus, who's now no longer a child, as he was when Odysseus left. And Telemachus himself will have a little Odyssey, we'll call it a Bildungsroman. When we study our Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, we'll talk more about this idea that you got to have these stories where young boys grow up into manhood and kind of go through several rites of passage to get there. In books 5 through 8, we finally see Odysseus. He's stuck on the island of the drop-dead gorgeous goddess Calypso. For 7 years he's been there. And then finally he gets to the island of the Phaeacians or the Phaeacians. In books 9 through 12, which is the heart of the Odyssey, put that in your notes. This is the flashback sequence that tells of the some 11 adventures of Odysseus that he had preceded, right? And then finally, books 13 through 24, this is the final, if you will, adventure number 12. This is Odysseus' return back to Ithaca, his reuniting with his son Telemachus, his purging his house of all these 108 bad guy suitors. He slaughters every one of them. And then 12 of the young girls who have been forced to work in his house and do all kinds of nasties with the suitors are rounded up and taken out, and they're hanged at the very end of this poem. Then Odysseus has his return to Penelope, and finally a return to his father Laertes, and that's kind of the end of this poem. By the way, none of this is really in chronological order. This is what we'll comment on, the power of the narrative structure, or what some have called the weakness of the narrative structure. Some people will say, readers, that they like the Iliad better because it's easier to read, because it's easier to follow the narrative sequence. Other readers will say, you know, I like the Odyssey better because of the nature of its kind of narrative scope. If you wanted chronologically to put this book in order, you would actually begin, of course, with books 9 through 12 and the adventures that Odysseus had right after he left the walls of Troy. Then that would follow books 5 through 8 and Odysseus' leaving of Calypso and going to the island of the Phaeacians. And as well, at the same time, contemporaneously, you would have books 1 through 4, and of course Thrasymachus' little, kind of journey to go and try and find out from first Nestor and then Menelaus, where's my dad, is he still alive, etc. Ending finally, of course, with books 13 through 24, which is the homecoming of Odysseus proper, right? I've often talked about it this way. You know how soap operas work, where, for example, you have scenes, like, for example, you have one scene where, I don't know, the mom and the mom and the daughter are fighting, okay, or talking or fighting, right? And then all of a sudden it fades out, and you go to the second scene, and the second scene is this guy doing this, driving his car somewhere or whatever, and then that fades out, and then you have a third scene where you have these two other people who are having like this conversation or whatever, and then all of a sudden they come back to the mom and the daughter again, and you are expected to keep in your mind that you understand all three of these things are happening kind of contemporaneously. Does that make sense? In the Odyssey, we have fundamentally kind of three stories happening at the same time. We have Mount Olympus, where Athena has decided it's time for Odysseus to come home, to leave the island of Calypso and come home. We have what's going on Ithaca, right? That is to say with Penelope and with Telemachus and with the suitors and all of that. And then finally we have what's happening with Odysseus himself on the island of Calypso, and then later on the island with the island of the Phaeacians. So you have multiple things happening at the same time. This is why we use that kind of cyclical rendering. At any given moment then in the poem, you have to pause and ask yourself, where are we? Okay? So, what are we looking at here? Well, let's go through some key ideas that obviously we're going to come back to in further lectures. The key metaphor, I believe, in many ways to read the Odyssey is the metaphor of weaving. Now, we saw some of this already in the Iliad. When we met Helen for the first time, remember, she's weaving, right? Okay, a rope. And the concept of weaving is, I think, even more important in the Odyssey. We're going to see typeset comparisons, and no question, we're supposed to think about Helen versus Penelope, no question about it. Penelope also weaves, but when she weaves, she's doing it for a certain kind of deception. For 3 years, she's been able to put off the suitors because what she does is weaves by day and undoes what her weaving by night. Calypso, contemporaneously, is holding Odysseus. Calypso's name actually means hiding or covering, right? Which is a different kind of weaving. And Odysseus will in fact say in Book 9, line 21, to Alcyone's, the king of the Phaeacians. I am Odysseus, he says, known for every kind of craft. And the Greek word here is doulos, and it means twisting, turning, crafty, right? And of course, we just read that in the opening lines, Odysseus is a man of twists and turns. The second idea that I want to introduce to you is, we've seen it as well in the Iliad, the idea of Xenia. Now, it's sometimes translated as guest-host relationship, sometimes understood as just hospitality. None of those words do justice to the idea of what Xenia actually is. The Greeks didn't have holiday inns or Ramada inns or comfort inns, okay? Greeks didn't have hotels. So when you traveled to another place as a stranger, you picked out a house that looked kind of like it was in your socioeconomic class. So for example, if you were a beggar, you went to a really poor shack. If you were somehow middle class, you went to some kind of house that looked middle class. If you were a king, you went to the castle, to the palace, all right? You walked up and you said, please take care of me for the night. Now there were rules that we really can't, I mean, it's kind of like Pirates of the Caribbean. We don't really call them rules, we call them guidelines, okay? They were accepted within the culture that there were certain things that would happen. Like for example, 1, you always got fed before anybody asked you who you were. That's a key. 2, while you were being taken care of in the house, the understanding was you're not supposed to mess with property and especially with wives, because Xenia only applies usually to men, with the exception of maybe like Athena when she's dressed as a man. It's a man's world, of course, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Xenia applies to the relationships between men. Think about then how naughty it is, right? When Paris shows up at Sparta and will take away Helen. He has violated, absolutely violated the rules of Xenia, right? Well, we're going to see this game played out all the way through the Odyssey. For example, we'll see at the very beginning of the Odyssey how it breaks down on the island of Ithaca, where we've got these nasty suitors who are just camping out in Odysseus' castle and saying, we will not leave until Penelope decides to marry one of us, okay? Telemachus is, of course, the man of the house, and all of his resources are being consumed. That is to say, they're not giving anything back. Part of Xenia, by the way, is that you're supposed to, if you can, give some kind of a gift as the visitor, right, to the host's house, and then the understanding is the next time somebody comes to your house, you reciprocate. By the way, it also breaks down. This Xenia thing breaks down, for example, in a major moment when we are in the cave of Polyphemus, one of the famous adventure stories in that flashback sequence. We'll see how Xenia holds up. Telemachus with Nestor, Telemachus with Menelaus on the island of Sparta, Odysseus especially on the island of the Phaeacians. The third thing we've mentioned already, this nostos idea of homecoming. It's used 3 times in the first 13 lines of the Odyssey. We'll get there in our opening comments about Book 1. But let's just think about this notion of homecoming and the idea that Odysseus wants so desperately to get home. By the way, he turns down, this is unheard of in mythology, he turns down Calypso's offer for immortality because he wants to get home so badly. Now later poets will of course redefine in many ways Odysseus as a man who longs to go on journeys. We think of Dante, and then I've already mentioned Tennyson's Ulysses. Dante, by the way, who never actually read Homer, he knew about Ulysses, the Latinate form of Odysseus, through Virgil, right, and the Aeneid, a poem that we'll study after we study the Odyssey. But in the Odyssey, Odysseus is not enjoying his adventures as much as he wants to get home. Everything is about getting back to where he has some power, some control, right? He'll do pretty much anything, say anything to get back home. That is to say, this is a poem of tensions, right? A story of tensions. One of the major kind of word pictures is Odysseus and his men have to sail between 2 nasty kinds of situations. Scylla, a 6-headed monster, and Charybdis, this really wicked, bad whirlpool. If you've ever heard the phrase between a rock and a hard place, here it is, right? These tensions permeate all the way through. Let's jot down a few of them and then look for them as we study the poem. Nature versus civilization. We'll see this right away in Odysseus' conversations with Polyphemus the Cyclops. Male versus female. That one you want to star because it's significant. Stasis versus movement. When we see Odysseus for the first time, he's sitting on a rock in Book 5, looking towards Ithaca. He's on the island of Calypso. And he's crying because he wants to be off the island, and he'll never get off the island, or so he feels, right? That movement, of course, will give us all of those different Odysseys. The Odyssey of Telemachus, the Odyssey of Odysseus, the Odyssey of Penelope, and on it goes, right? we have, of course, the tension of truth versus deception, right? You'll remember in the Iliad, when Odysseus, interestingly, is the one with the entourage of Phrynox and Ajax, who come to Achilles' tent. There is Patroclus, Achilles strumming his lyre and dreaming about stories of fallen heroes. You'll remember that in Iliad 9:378, Achilles actually says, I hate the man who says one thing but hides another in his heart. And it's here, of course, that you've got Odysseus and Achilles as character types. And we'll even call them, of course, an Achillean character type, an Odyssean character type. Achilles is the kind of guy that tells you exactly what he feels. I'm mad, I'm going to my tent, and then I'm going to jack somebody later because my best pal gets killed. Odysseus is a different kind of character. An Odyssean character is a character who loves to do the very thing Achilles says he hates the most, right? Odysseus loves to say one thing and then keep another in his heart. Although, ironically, the lines are actually echoed from Iliad 9 in Odyssey 14. Line 182, Odysseus says, I hate that man who stoops to peddling lies. That is to say, the story I'm about to tell you, Alcyoneus, is in fact absolutely true. All this stuff really happened. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about our approach now to the study of the Odyssey. It's going to be very similar in template to what we were doing with the Iliad. We will build off of our learning theory, that desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways, and we'll do that primarily, of course, through our 3 levels of reading. We talk about it at the beginning, of course, of every one of our conversations because it's the key objective for us. We're going to answer 3 guiding questions when we're reading. What does the text say? Summary. What does the text mean? Here we'll subdivide it. 2A themes, messages. We're going to be looking for those in every book. And then at 2B, the rhetorical, not what Homer says, but how Homer says it. In the Iliad and Odyssey study, we focused on symbolism and we focused on irony. Guys, I think it makes sense for us to just continue that. So we'll continue to look at symbolism and irony. Obviously, we'll look at things like epic similes and other kinds of elements, rhetorical elements of the text. But we'll look at those 2, continuing to look at those 2. And we're going to ask if we see any similar kinds of symbols, any similar kinds of ironies that are happening between the 2 poems. At level 3, we ask, how can I relate this to other things I know? That is to say, how can I own this text? At 3A, we're going to focus here, and this is important, so put it in your notes. We're going to focus here on our reading of the Odyssey using our study of the Iliad. So, for example, we're going to ask interesting questions like, what happens at book 22 of the Iliad? Well, that's where Achilles jacks Hector. Well, what happens at book 22 of the Odyssey? Well, that's when Odysseus jacks the suitors. So we're going to see some of these books that will have one-to-one correspondence, and other of these books that not at all, okay? So we're always asking that question, and obviously we're asking questions about any prior books of the Odyssey, because these stories, we learned this in our study of the Iliad, right? These stories are leading us, right, book by book, towards what happens in the final third of the poem. We're certainly going to see this in the Odyssey as well, okay? Now, some have said that the Odyssey is so different, it can't be the same author. Or even a female author, Samuel Butler made this argument, and Robert Graves made this argument, that a female author is in fact the originator poet of this text. And in fact, Graves argued that it has to be the young girl Nausicaa briefly mentioned in the poem of the Odyssey. We'll get to Nausicaa and just how fascinating she is. But watch some of the examples that maybe lead people to think this way. Think about, we'll just pick one thing. Think about the relationship of men and women in the Iliad, right? We talked a lot about the treatment of women, horrific often treatment of women in the Iliad. Think about though when men and women are together and having an exchange that's of importance in the Iliad. You obviously have Helen in Paris, right? She can give it to him pretty hard, right? You have Andromache and of course Hector, right? Especially that famous scene of Iliad 6, right, where she speaks for the last time with him. And you have, of course, Hecuba and Priam, right, the king and queen of Troy. Other than that, though, if you'll think about it, you have virtually like for example, you never have Achilles talking with Briseis. Hey, what do you think about this? No, you don't have any of that kind of thing going on. The women are virtually silent, and they take back seats. Although they're given some voice occasionally, but most of the time it's in the form of soliloquies. Like remember at the end of book 24, when you have the 3 lamentations, remember, of Hecuba Andromache and as well Helen. But it's not like exchanges with men. Think about this. In the Odyssey, and I know we haven't read it, and I've only given you a brief plot summary, but I'll say it nonetheless. In the Odyssey, you only have two major scenes in all of the Odyssey where somehow the feminine, or women, are not somehow present. You have the Cyclops in the cave story, and you have the final slaughter scene, where Penelope is upstairs sleeping. But even in that scene, you still have Athena at least tangentially there, right? Fascinating. Note, the role of Athena is significant, so let's put that in our notes. While Athena plays a role in the Iliad, the role she plays in the Odyssey is far more profound. It's all been set up for us, obviously, in the Iliad. Occasionally we'll hear, men will say, oh, you're Odysseus, yeah, you're always protected by a goddess Athena. That's why nobody can mess with you. We're certainly going to see this here, right? Although, we're going to see some interesting exchanges. A pivotal exchange when Odysseus lands in Ithaca will be with Athena, but he doesn't know it's Athena. And she asks him, where have you been? And he spins this lie, because he's really good at this, spinning this lie. When we get to our study of Machiavelli's The Prince, Machiavelli will say that the ideal prince is one who can lie really well and nobody knows. It seems like it's the truth even though it's a lie. And halfway through his story about Crete and fighting bulls and all this other kind of stuff, Athena changes into Athena and she goes, you are amazing the way you can tell a lie. Unbelievable the way you can weave a story. Right? Now, we're going to make all kinds of connections with the Iliad. Let's just take a look at a few of these, maybe 3 examples, just to set us up so that we can look at this closely. For example, watch this. I've already mentioned that you can have Achillean versus Odyssean character types. Character comparisons are fascinating. For example, in the Iliad, think of this. Achilles is alone for most of the Iliad, right? Sitting in his tent, withdrawn, pouting because he doesn't give his girl Briseis. When we see Odysseus for the first time, guess what? He's also alone, sitting on the island of Calypso, hoping that